for the last 2 years, when I was working as a postdoc at the University of Edinburgh, and Jack Van Ness, who is a Mercator Fellow of TRR, he was working with me in Edinburgh. And this is a work joined with Bia Villas-Boas from Colorado School of Mines and Will Yang from UCSD.
Switch off these buttons there.
I don't know. I can't find my mouse tool here. I think it will disappear.
You can just, if you go on OK, can you go on OK with yours? Maybe you don't see it in your presentation mode.
Yeah, I can't see my mouse. Oh,
There, yeah.
okay. Oh, good. Okay, and I also want to. Oh no. Okay, it's okay.
Just mechanical.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, just a brief reintroduction of myself. I started in September this year, and I'm going to be a young project leader. And I'm in the project group W2 of TRR, and I'm officially affiliated at the University of Hamburg. And on the TRR proposal that we were writing before, I am a machine learning specialist, and I proposed on the proposal to use some machine learning approaches to infer tidal energetics from sea surface observations. However, this is not what I do exclusively. My research interest lie broadly in the studies of interactions or how to disentangle the waves and mean flows. And I'm happy to use any tools that are good. And in today's talk, there will be no machine learning, and it will be about another kind of waves, a wave that's not internal tide, will be about surface waves. So this branch of work is motivated by the big picture that in the AIC's interface, there is an important coupled system formed by the winds in the atmosphere and the currents on the ocean surface and the waves on the ocean surface. So in this context, the terminology is that the currents are referring to anything that's faster than the surface waves. So we are not being very ambitious in this line of work. We're only interested in one area in this coupled system, which is the impact of the currents on the surface waves. And classically, a lot of has been known already. So for example, the currents are known to be able to modulate the propagation, the propagation direction of the surface waves. So there is a classical formula, it's referred to as a distance formula sometimes, which says that if you do ray tracing of the surface waves, then the curvature of the waves are going to be proportional to the proportion between the vorticity of the currents versus the group velocity of the waves. So this is demonstrating it in a very idealized setup where we have an isolated vortex like this. And then these dots are the rays of the surface waves. And these vorticities are positive only. So then all the rays are bending upwards. And at some point, it will start to converge. And at the points where they converge, the surface wave energy will be much stronger than before they encounter the currents. Our study, so this is one of the effects that will be considered in our results. Another motivation comes from the observations in modeling studies, which they find out that the currents indeed really modulate the surface wave energetics by a lot. So in this community, a popular quantity to look at is called the significant wave height, which is also what we will discuss as the main quantity in the talk. And it is really just defined as 4 times the rho mean square of the sea surface height. And here the rho mean square is average over the time snapshots. and it's computed for every spatial location. It really is just a metric that's reflecting how strong the surface wave energy is. In this modeling study was they do a global oceanic. This is a global oceanic circulation simulation, and so they compute the surface the significant wave height arising from the surface waves. And if they keep the currents there, this is how the significant wave height will look like. This is how the currents look like. And we can see that there are interesting patterns emerging. And especially, this is how the significant wave height looks like without the currents. And it's much more boring. It's almost plain in the open ocean. And once you turn on the currents, there will be a lot of interesting modulations. And also, it definitely seems related to the currents patterns. So, like there is this Gulf Stream, and you also see an amplification around here. But the correspondence is not exactly local. There are definitely, so like for example, there are rings here, but the response is not co-located with the rings. So it's not that. So the response of surface of the significant wave height to the currents is also known to be non-local and complex. And then there's another interesting previous modeling study that's looking at more idealized synthetic data. So this was led by Bia, who is one of our co-authors in this in the work we will talk about. So these 16 panels are presenting the response of the significant wave height to the currents. So they are all plotting the significant wave height. And within each panel, the underlying currents have the same mean kinetic energy. What's different between each panel is that Bia varied from left to right the proportion of divergent currents in the kinetic energy budget. So the left columns correspond to currents that are more rotational, and the right columns correspond to currents that are more divergent. And then you can see that, so the color bars are kept the same for each panel. So you can see that the significant wave height response for the more rotational currents are clearly stronger than the response for divergent currents. And also the responses to the rotational currents are streaky in the sense that they seem to be extended, they seem to be elongated in this way. And this is related to the incoming direction of the surface waves. So the incoming surface waves are mostly propagating from left to right. There are some variations in the angles, but they are all centered from left to right. So we can say that from these pictures, it looks like the response of the significant wave height to the current seem to be elongated to the direction of the surface waves propagation. Yeah.
Can you tell us how these experiments are done? Is this a surface wave model coupled to one layer of ocean?
Yeah. So this is so the surface wave stuff is computed by WAVEWATCH III. So it was solving the wave action equation exactly. And it's a ray tracing based numerical solver. And the currents here, they are just synthetic currents from doubly periodic domains. And so Bia just prescribed power spectra for the kinetic energy, and then she draws random samples from them. And
the current is without shear, I guess, right? Because otherwise it's difficult to implement.
What do you mean it's without shear? Oh no, this is just a surface. This is just in X and Y. So it's just a two-dimensional random field that's drawn from a two-dimensional power spectral function. So we won't talk about anything the vertical, and we're considering that we're only looking at the surface.
Switch it on.
I think maybe the CO2 is
And what's the difference between this wave model and the standard wave model like Wang? I mean,
This I don't know that well.
the way if you do wave tracing, is that different than by considering a random wave field? And then with the wave spectrum and that.
I think for this wave mode, so for this example, she was sampling the waves from wave spectra that's prescribed. So they are random in this sense. But
so they pick up one particular wave at particular wave number and then trace that wave.
Yes, yeah, that's.
So like when the model, like WAVEWATCH is like when, right? It's not no difference.
Oh yeah, I don't know when, so I don't.
And it's also solving this equation, but it assumes a random field so that you have a continuous spectrum.
Yes. So yeah, I know that. Yeah.
Asking whether you are tracing deterministic waves or are you considering a random spectrum and with a full spectrum with continuous.
Yeah, so it is a continuum of
one particular wave.
Oh, I think she samples from the spectrum and then she waits for some statistical convergence. Okay, so we see that the rotational currents induce small modulations in the significant wave height. And they induce these streaks that are elongated in the same direction as as the primary direction of the wave propagation. And another thing she changes that, so from the top rows to the bottom rows, she changed the spectral slope of the kinetic energies spectra of the currents. And the upper panels correspond to shallower spectral slopes. So they would correspond to currents that are in general living on smaller spatial scales. And the lower column correspond to currents that are in general living on larger spatial scales. And you can see that the response of the significant wave height to the currents also seem to be behaving this way, in the sense that if the currents have smaller spatial scales, then the patterns of significant wave height also have more details at the smaller spatial scales. And the responses to larger scale currents seem more blurred, meaning that the significant wave height variation is more concentrated on the larger current spatial scales. And with the new tool developed in our work, we'll be able to explain everything that I was mentioning in an analytical way. So our setup, the punchline is that we developed some tool called the U2H map. And it's a silly name. It just means that we're mapping the current's velocity U to significant wave height HS or H modulations. And the assumptions required for the U2H map are the following. So first, we need to assume that there is a spatial scale separation between the currents and the surface waves. So this is so that we can then look at the wave action conservation in the position wave number space. So then this assumption holds pretty well for the surface wave current interactions, because the wavelengths of the surface waves are about 10 or about 100 meters. And for some mesoscale currents, we are looking at, they are like tens of kilometers. So there's a very good scale separation. So using the wave action conservation is a pretty safe starting point. We do have to say that we ignore everything on the right-hand side, which usually includes, for example, forcing from the winds. And we don't consider that in our work. Another assumption we need to make is that we assume that the current speed are small compared to the group velocity of the waves. And this introduces a small parameter epsilon, which is the ratio between the typical current speeds and the group velocity of the waves. And this is, again, pretty well satisfied for surface waves, because the group velocities are about 10 meters per second, which is much stronger than the typical current speed on the surface. And then we also treat the currents as a frozen field, in the sense that, so we are assuming that by the time the surface waves exist the domain of the currents haven't changed much. So the currents is not evolving in time. And this also allows us to look at the steady state response of the wave action equation. So basically ignoring the time derivative. And then the third assumption is that the background wave action, here in this talk, when I say background, I refer to the wave action or some other surface wave quantities that were how they were like without being affected by the currents. So we assume that the background waves, in the absence of the currents, have a spatially uniform wave action. So then basically we are saying that without the currents, the wave action is only a function of the wave number k. And then finally, we assume that the modulation of the significant wave height from the currents is small compared to the background significant wave height. So it should be at the order epsilon compared to the background. So under this setup, we are basically starting. So we are basically imagining that. So first, we assume that there is a spatially uniform surface wave field, and then it gets modulated by the currents, and the U2H map is mapping the modulation of the significant wave height that arises from the currents. And then, so this is one like, so this is just showing off how good it will be. So this is the underlying current speed, which looks like this. This is from MIT GCM outcome in the California current system. And this is the significant wave height modulation from the currents computed by the U2H map. The incoming waves are assumed again to be dominantly from left to right. And this is what the WAVEWATCH III would give us if it solves for the same equation or the same setup numerically. And by the way, it may sound like a lot of assumptions here, but this was also the assumptions done in a lot of previous works.
The first is the same as in WAVEWATCH III.
Yes, so WAVEWATCH III also has to assume this because whenever you write wave action equation like this, you are assuming that. And then the weak current speed, it actually holds pretty well in the ocean for surface waves. And the other assumptions are also often assumed for WAVEWATCH III demonstrations.
How do you derive this map? You have assumptions, but then how you?
I will briefly touch upon that later. So yeah, this is just a bluffing picture to make you interested. So we are saying that applying the U2H map to this complicated current snapshot will give you a result that matches very, very well with WAVEWATCH III outcomes. And to produce the WAVEWATCH III outcome, BSS to produce this panel, it took a few hundred CPU hours on the cluster. But our U2H map is a linear map. It just takes a few seconds on this laptop to compute. So this is how we compute the U2H map. This is the sketch of how we do it. So based on our assumptions, we can do a perturbation expansion of the wave action equation. So we can expand the frequency of the waves in this way, where sigma is the intrinsic frequency of the surface waves, and this is the Doppler shift term. And this epsilon here is a bookkeeping parameter. It's just saying that this Doppler shift term is at order epsilon compared to the intrinsic frequency. And this expansion arises from our assumption that the group speed of the waves is much stronger than the current speeds. So we expand the frequency in this way, and the frequency enters the wave action equations through these terms. And we can also expand the wave action equation. So we can also expand the wave action in this way where the first term A bar corresponds to the background wave action that's in the absence of the currents and is already assumed to be spatially uniform. And then the second term, the small a, is the modulation of the wave action that's induced by the currents. And from our assumption that the response has to be small, it can also be expanded formally as something that's at the order epsilon here. And then we just substitute them back to the wave action equation, and we ignore the time derivative. So we actually introduce a small dissipation term to represent the time derivative, which is showing up here in this parameter mu, but mu will be taken to be infinitely close to zero in later derivations. So these are all the epsilon terms that's remaining in the wave action equation. And here we are relating on the right-hand side something that's related to the background wave action and the current speed to something on the left-hand side, which is related to the modulation of the wave action, the small a. So I just want to point out that, so here you can already see that the small a, which is a change in the wave action due to the currents, it's a linear function. This response is linear to the current velocities. And then there is a nice quality of surface of deep water surface gravity waves that we consider here, which is that the kinetic and the potential energy are the same. They are the same for the deep water surface gravity waves. So because of this, the significant wave height, which is 4 times the Riemann square of the wave height, is also linear in the wave action. So it can be written in this way. And therefore, we also expand the significant wave height in this way. And the small hs is the modulation of the significant wave height that's induced by the currents. And this is again also at order epsilon compared to the background significant wave height. And since we established in previous slides that the small a is linear in the currents, and we can see here that the significant wave height is also linear in the small a, then it's obvious that the significant wave height is also, the modulation of the significant wave height due to the currents also has to be linear in the current velocities. And then this is just roughly how we do it mathematically. So this is all we have, all the equations we need to derive the U2H map. And we solve this in the Fourier space, which is doing the Fourier transform from the x vector, the position vector, to Q, which is the Fourier wave vector corresponding to the positions. There is already like a confusion of terminologies here in the sense that we have two wave numbers. One is the k, which is the wave number for the surface waves, and the other one is q, which is the Fourier wave vector that corresponds to x. So roughly speaking, the k wave vector corresponds to the modulations of wave phases of the surface waves. And the q vector corresponds to the modulation of the currents at the spatial scales of the currents. And then we can just do the math, and this is a sneak peek of some intermediate step where we try to express the U2H map in the Fourier space in terms of q. And since we established before that HS is linear in U, it is possible to just express the U2H map as a simple dot product between a linear operator and the Fourier coefficients of the velocities. And in this intermediate step, this is just showing how complicated the derivation may get if you look at the paper. So in this intermediate step, we can see that this linear operator takes this form, which is really a function of just the background wave action. And what is tricky is that in the first term here, you can take the mu, which comes from this small dissipation parameter, to be 0, and the first integral will not blow up. So the first integral can be just converted to k squared times this gradient of background A. But the second integral will blow up if you take mu to be exactly 0, because there will be a singularity when the k is perpendicular to q. And so this integral has to be computed using some complex analysis methods. But these are all standard methods in complex analysis. So this can still be computed. I'm not going to present how this will look like in the end. It's just some complicated expression that's in terms of the background wave action. But for now, we can just remember that the U2H map looks like this in the Fourier space, which is a simple dot product. And now we can go back and try to explain what has been found in this previous work. So
Could you also solve by integration along the characteristics, the C lines? Because the equation looks like change along C direction. Yeah, the first equation. Yeah. You can just integrate along.
Okay. Interesting point. We did that. That's not how we do this in our work. So in our work, we just take a Fourier transform of this basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, we didn't think about it in that way, but that will be very messy if your waves come from a continuum of directions. Okay, so then we can actually explain everything that's noted on this slide before, which was as a reminder, we are saying that the response of the significant wave height are stronger under rotational currents, and the patterns are elongated in the same direction of the wave's propagation. And we also noted before that if the currents underlying are at a larger spatial scale, then the response of this significant wave height also seems to be at a larger spatial scale. So this can all be explained by the properties of this L operator we derived in this work. So roughly, so this is a qualitative explanation on why we see all this stuff in the previous works. So we can split the U2H map into a part that's related to only the rotational currents, which is the first term here. P of psi is a shorthand for the string function, and another part that's induced by the divergent parts. So this is phi. This is denoting the potential function. So we find out that these coefficients L psi and L phi have some very striking properties. So this is how they will look like in the space of the Fourier wave vector Q. So the horizontal axis here is Q1, and the vertical axis here is Q2. And this panel is plotting the amplitude of the L psi coefficient, and this panel is plotting the amplitude of the L phi coefficient. And this is an example that, importantly, it arises from a set of background wave action spectrum that's corresponding to surface waves that are propagating mostly from left to right, and it has very small directional spreading. So it is really mostly dominantly from exactly left to right. The standard deviation of the incoming directions is about 10 degrees. It's considered very small for surface waves. So for this kind of incoming waves with very small directional spreadings, this is how the amplitude of L psi and L phi look like. And we can see that first, the color maps are the same. So this means that the amplitude of L psi is much bigger than the amplitude of L phi. So this explains why the response to the rotational currents is much stronger than the response to the divergent currents. And another property is that the offset coefficient is really concentrating along this line in the Fourier vector space, which correspond to the direction that's perpendicular to the primary direction of the waves. So if you do an inverse Fourier transform of some function that's concentrating along this axis, then the pattern you will get in the real space will be indeed elongated towards the direction of the wave propagation. However, all these arguments I'm saying here are not going to hold anymore if the incoming waves are not concentrated along a certain direction. So so we can demonstrate this with another set of synthetic examples. So here I'm not using WAVEWATCH III anymore. I'm using the U2H map to compute the significant wave height, because we established that they are going to give you the same result, and the U2H is much faster.
Yeah, but only for small directional spreading.
We also benchmark it with cases with larger directional spreading in the paper. So this is from the U2H map. So here, these panels are showing how the speeds of the currents are like. So these are also very simple two-dimensional doubly periodic synthetic currents. And then these are the outcomes when the directional spreading of the background surface waves are very small. So everything is qualitatively similar as what has been found in previous work by Bia. However, if I make the directional spreading to be large, I forgot how large it is. I think the standard deviation is about maybe something like 60 degrees. Then if the incoming waves have large directional spreading, meaning that they are coming more like all in all the directions. They just have a median value that's centered from left to right, but they can come in this direction, for example, very likely. Then the response will look like this. So then we can still see some traces of what they seen before, in the sense that the patterns here, which correspond to more rotational currents, are still slightly stronger than the patterns here, which are rise from divergent currents. But the difference is really not that big anymore. And also, for example, the streakiness of the patterns under rotational currents are also much weaker here when the incoming waves have large directional spreadings. We can also explain the thing about the spatial scale that's found in the previous work. So this is also reflected in these examples, where I changed the spatial scale of the currents between this row and this row. And when the currents have larger spatial scales, again, we see that the significant wave height have larger spatial scales. And this also seems to hold even when the directional spreading is large. In the sense that everything here is having smaller spatial scales than everything here. So this can also be explained by the U2H map. So this is our operator, and it turns out that we can actually see this early on in the derivation. So in this intermediate step, we can see that there is a spatial derivative here, and there is also a spatial derivative here, and they are just oriented towards different directions. So this actually means that this operator in the Fourier space is a function of the angle of the Fourier vector only. It's not a function of the magnitude of the Fourier wave vector Q. So this can explain why the significant wave height seems to have the same spatial scales as the currents, because you are just rearranging the distribution in the Fourier angles. You are not rearranging things between different wave number magnitudes. So if you compute the power spectra of significant wave height, for example, then it's really just the power spectra of the currents timed by some linear operator that's a function of the angle only. So then, very roughly speaking, we should expect similar spectral slope of the kinetic energy power spectra and the power spectra of the significant wave height. And this can have a lot of implications for observations. However, we need to make a refinement on this statement in the sense that in all the examples I have shown you today, including the ones from the previous work, for simplicity, they have set so in the power spectra of the currents, they prescribe the rotational and divergent kinetic energy separately. And for simplicity, they have set the spectral slopes to be the same for the divergent and rotational currents. So actually, the things will be more complicated if the rotational and divergent currents have different spectral slopes. And this is actually the case for the ocean, where we know that for oceanic currents, the rotational kinetic energy tend to have a steeper spectral slope than the kinetic energy spectra of the divergent currents. So this will make things slightly more complicated, in the sense that if we recall this split of the U2H map in terms of the rotational and divergent fingerprints, then we also remember that we have a result that when the incoming background waves have small directional spreadings, then this rotational coefficient is going to be much larger than the divergent coefficient. So then for background waves with small directional spreadings, the power spectra of the significant wave height is going to be much more affected by the power spectra of the rotational kinetic energy instead of the divergent kinetic energy. So then the consequence of this for the ocean is that since in the ocean, the rotational kinetic energy have a steeper spectral slope than the divergent kinetic energy, meaning that the rotational currents also have, in general, larger spatial scales than the divergent currents. This means that overall, the significant wave height response will also have a larger spatial scale than the total currents. By total, I mean the sum of the rotational and divergent currents. We can demonstrate this with a more complicated, slightly more complicated synthetic example, where I'm setting the rotational currents to follow this power law in the asymptotic spectrum, and the divergent kinetic energy follow this power law in the asymptotic power spectrum. And I set it so that the rotational currents have a steeper slope than the divergent currents, and they cross over at about 100 kilometers. This is just a pedagogical example. The parameters are not really that realistic in the ocean. But I just want to demonstrate that if the power spectra have different spectral slopes in the rotational and divergent currents, then overall, the significant wave height power spectra will have a steeper slope than the total kinetic energy spectra. So here in this plot, the red line is the power spectra, the asymptotic power spectra of the significant wave height, and the blue dashed line is the asymptotic power spectrum of the total kinetic energy that includes the contributions from rotational divergent currents. And the left panel here corresponds to surface waves with large directional spreadings. So we find that even when the directional spreadings are large, this effect is still visible, although not as strong as the case when the background wave have small directional spreadings. So we can see that in both these panels, the slopes of the red line is always steeper than the slope of the dashed blue line. And in the real space, we can also look at how they look like. So this is the plot of the current speed, and this is the plot of the significant wave height under large directional spreadings. And this is the plot of the significant wave height under small directional spreadings. And we can see that maybe particularly for the snapshot with small directional spreadings, that overall the spatial scales of significant wave height is larger than the spatial scale of the currents. And for this, it's also slightly larger than the currents. It's not so easy to see in the real space. So this is what is mostly done in the published and the work that we're trying to wrap up currently. So in summary, we developed this thing called the usage map, which is an analytical linear operator that maps the current velocities to significant wave heights modulated by the currents. The assumptions involved are first the scale separation so that we can use the wave action conservation, and the weak current assumption, which is assuming the current speed is much weaker than the group speed of the waves. And we assume that in the absence of the currents, the significant wave height is spatially uniform. And we also assume that the modulation of the significant wave height by the currents is small compared to the background. And we have benchmarked it very carefully with WAVEWATCH III outcomes, and it agrees with WAVEWATCH III very well. And our method is thousands, if not millions times cheaper than WAVEWATCH III. And we can also provide an analytical framework to explain and refine some statements that's found from the phenomenon in the model outcomes. And one potential future direction, maybe particularly in the context of the TRR Center, is that so we are focusing on significant wave height, but the same framework could be applied to anything that's linearly related to wave action. So it could be also applied to compute the depth average surface Stokes rate, for example. We haven't done anything about it. This is just speculating. And another possible future direction here is that if we are willing to assume wave action conservation for internal waves, then you can also apply the same technique to study internal waves. The fact that their dispersion relationships are different are not going to be that consequential, I think. The main thing is that you need to assume wave action conservation and this weak current and uniform background assumptions. And this is another ongoing work that's done in Biel's group. So this is a very exciting thing that the SWOT is actually observing the significant wave height that are measured concurrently with sea surface height. And it's already generating data like this, where they have the sea surface height observations. They also have the observations of the significant wave height. And this is some very preliminary result by Gwen, who is a postdoc in Biel's group. And this is a snapshot where, so this is the significant wave height that's observed by SWOT along these tracks. It looks like this. And then what's shown here is the U2H outcome computed from the geostropic velocity that's inferred from a sea surface height in SWOT. So this is a very rough calculation in the sense that it's so you don't actually have access to the currents. You only have the sea surface height, and this is the simplest thing you can do, which is to do the geostropic velocity. And for the U2H map, we also need a background. We also need information about what is the background surface waves. And Gwen just used the measurements from surface buoy. That's the closest he can find from this SWOT observation. And that's still at least tens of kilometers away. So everything is very rough in this calculation. But still, you can see that there is a very good qualitative agreement between the U2H outcome and the SWOT observation of significant wave height. And I think this is very exciting because you can actually see this complicated theory appear in a core satellite outcome. So that's all I prepared for now.
Yeah, thank you for this talk. Thank you, it was very interesting. I wanna, can we actually reverse the problem too? If you have like the SWOT measurements of the sea surface of the significant wave height,
yeah.
Can you reverse the currents out of this?
So yeah, that's a very good question, and it's going to be much harder because so first for the U2H map, we need both components in the surface, on the surface. So just from the point of view of solvability, it's not going to be that easy because the U2H map maps two components to HS, which is one scalar, and you cannot possibly do the reverse exactly. But I think this is a very interesting inverse problem. So, and I think analytically speaking, I know that if your income is, if your background surface waves are strictly parallel waves, then you can infer the integral of the rotational velocity along the wave's path. So that can be done analytically, but it's not that realistic in the ocean. And when your background waves are not exactly parallel waves, the problem becomes more and more ill-conditioned. And but I think this can be an interesting long-term project to work on. There are also a lot of interest in inferring maybe not the deterministic snapshot like this, but some statistical properties of the currents. And this may be a lower hanging fruit, although we haven't done anything yet. So I didn't show in this talk, but as a consequence of this split, you can show that if the background waves are have small directional spreadings, then there is a correspondence of the spectral slopes of the kinetic energy spectra with the spectral slope of the significant wave height, depending on which direction you are measuring. So like, so I'm talking about one-dimensional along track observations. So there is some analytical relations between their spectral slopes. So in principle, if the data is good enough, you could indeed at least infer something about the spectral slope of the rotational and divergent currents from significant wave height. This is another, so by the way, this is another important thing about the SWOT observations, which is that the SWOT actually resolves significant wave height at a much smaller spatial resolution, at a much more refined spatial resolution than the observations of the sea surface height. So I think the information at the smaller scales or from the significant wave height in SWOT, maybe it can indeed at least tell you something about the spectra of the currents. But it is going to be a very challenging